The morning sun cast long shadows across the recruitment center on Kepler 442b. A world where survival wasn't just a skill. It was an art form. Sarah Martinez wiped the sweat from her brow as she finished her daily routine of checking the atmospheric processors. The machines hummed constantly, fighting against the planet's naturally toxic air that could kill an unprotected human in minutes. "Another day in paradise," muttered Jake Thompson, emerging from the underground bunker that served as their temporary barracks. His weathered hands bore the scars of countless repairs made in hostile conditions, each mark a testament to humanity's stubborn refusal to give up. Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. Paradise would have breathable air and water that doesn't try to dissolve your teeth. The two recruits had been on Kepler 442b for 6 months now, part of an experimental program that even their commanding officers seemed uncertain about. Earth's military had started recruiting from the harshest human settlements scattered across the galaxy, worlds where people lived in constant danger, where weakness meant death, and where every day was a battle against an environment that seemed designed to kill them. Their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, approached with his usual grim expression. Hayes was old-school military, the kind of man who believed that soldiers were forged in fire, not in comfortable training facilities. He'd volunteered for this assignment when most officers had rejected it as career suicide. "Listen up, recruits," Hayes called out, his voice cutting through the morning wind that carried the metallic scent of the planet's mineral-rich atmosphere. "We just received new orders. Pack your gear. We're moving out in 30 minutes. Marcus Chen looked up from the weapon maintenance station, where he'd been cleaning his rifle, a weapon modified specifically for this world's corrosive environment. "Where to this time, sir?" Hayes smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Somewhere. That makes this place look like a vacation resort." The recruits exchanged glances. They'd all volunteered for this program for different reasons. Sarah had grown up on a mining colony where cave-ins and equipment failures were daily occurrences. Jake came from a farming settlement on a world with unpredictable solar flares that could fry electronics without warning. Marcus had been raised on a space station orbiting a dying star, where radiation exposure was measured in acceptable daily doses, rather than lifetime limits. What united them wasn't their backgrounds, it was their ability to function when everything went wrong, to solve problems with limited resources, and to keep going when others would have given up. Earth's military had finally realized that these qualities might be more valuable than traditional training. As they packed their gear, Sarah couldn't help but think about the rumors they'd been hearing. Something big was happening in the outer sectors, something that had the top brass worried enough to create this experimental unit. The official word was that they were testing new training methods, but Sarah suspected there was more to it. The transport ship that arrived was nothing like the sleek vessels shown in recruitment videos. It was a utilitarian craft, built for function rather than form, with thick armor plating and the kind of backup systems that suggested its previous missions hadn't been routine. Captain Rodriguez, the ship's pilot, greeted them with a nod that managed to convey both respect and wariness. "Welcome aboard. I hope you've got strong stomachs, because where we're going, things get interesting fast." As the ship lifted off from Kepler 442b's surface, Sarah watched through the porthole as the world that had nearly killed her dozens of times grew smaller. She felt an odd mixture of relief and nostalgia. Despite everything, she'd learned to call that hostile place home. "So, where exactly are we headed?" Jake asked as they settled into the cramped passenger compartment. Captain Rodriguez exchanged a look with Lieutenant Colonel Hayes before answering. "The Nexus Point. Ever heard of it?" The temperature in the compartment seemed to drop several degrees. Even the recruits from the harshest worlds had heard whispers about the Nexus Point, a region of space where 3 different alien species had been locked in a standoff for over a century. It was supposedly neutral territory. But everyone knew that neutrality in space was often just another word for too dangerous for anyone to claim. Hayes took over the briefing. For the past 112 years, the Korthak Empire, the Xelian Confederation, and the hegemony of Keth have maintained a 3-way standoff at the Nexus Point. Each species claims the territory, but none has been willing to risk full-scale war by making the first move. Marcus frowned. "What's so important about empty space?" "It's not empty," Rodriguez interjected. The Nexus Point controls access to the most stable hyperspace routes in this sector. Whoever controls it controls trade and military movement for dozens of star systems. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's life support system. And what exactly are we supposed to do about it? We're just trainees. Hayes's expression grew serious. That's where it gets interesting. The Galactic Council has been trying to mediate this dispute for decades, without success. Recently, they decided to try something new. They're bringing in humans as neutral arbitrators. The silence that followed was broken only by the hum of the ship's engines. Finally, Jake voiced what they were all thinking. Sir, with respect, we're not diplomats. We're soldiers. Barely trained ones at that. That's exactly the point, Hayes replied. The three species involved have been negotiating with career diplomats, military strategists, and political theorists for over a century. Every conversation follows the same patterns, uses the same arguments, and reaches the same deadlocks. He paused, looking at each recruit in turn. But you've never been taught to think like diplomats. You've been taught to solve problems, to survive, to find solutions when conventional wisdom says there aren't any. That's exactly what this situation needs, Captain Rodriguez added. Plus, all three species have underestimated humans before. They see us as a young, inexperienced race. That might work to our advantage. Sarah looked around at her fellow recruits. They'd been chosen not for their diplomatic skills or their knowledge of alien psychology, but for their ability to function under pressure and their talent for unconventional problem-solving. It seemed impossible that such qualities could resolve a century-old interstellar dispute. But then again, their entire training had been about doing the impossible. The ship continued its journey through hyperspace, carrying them toward a confrontation that would test not just their abilities, but humanity's place in the galaxy. None of them could have imagined that within days, they would be facing down some of the most powerful military forces in known space, armed with nothing but their wits and the hard-earned lessons of life on humanity's harshest worlds. As the hours passed, Hayes briefed them on the three alien species they would encounter. The Korthak were a warrior culture that valued strength above all else. They had maintained their position at the Nexus Point through sheer military might. But their aggressive nature had prevented them from gaining broader support from other species. The Xelian Confederation was a trade-focused civilization that viewed everything in terms of profit and loss. They claimed the Nexus Point based on ancient trade agreements and had built their argument around legal precedent and commercial necessity. The hegemony of Keth was perhaps the most alien of the three, a collective consciousness that made decisions through consensus among billions of individuals. They claimed the Nexus Point as sacred space, arguing that it held religious significance that transcended mere territorial disputes. Each species has valid points, Hayes explained. That's what makes this so complicated. Traditional diplomacy focuses on finding compromise, but these three cultures are so different that they can't even agree on what constitutes a fair compromise. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. So we need to think outside the box. More than that, Hayes replied. We need to throw away the box entirely. The ship's intercom crackled to life with Captain Rodriguez's voice. We're approaching the Nexus Point. I'm reading 3 massive fleets maintaining their positions. This is going to be interesting. Through the ship's main viewport, they could see the reality of the century-old standoff. 3 distinct fleets hung in space, each positioned to watch the others, while maintaining defensive formations. The ships ranged from massive dreadnoughts that could level planets to sleek fighters that darted between the larger vessels like angry insects. The scale was overwhelming. Each fleet represented the military might of an entire galactic civilization, and they had been sitting here, watching each other, for longer than some human colonies had existed. Remember, Hayes said as they prepared for their arrival, we're not here to pick sides or impose human values. We're here to find a solution that works for everyone involved. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. They weren't just representing themselves or even humanity, They were potentially the key to resolving a conflict that had shaped interstellar politics for over a century. As their ship moved toward the center of the standoff, communication channels opened simultaneously from all three fleets. The Korthak demanded to know their business in Warrior space. The Xelians wanted to see their commercial permits and trading credentials. The Keth Collective simply asked if they came in peace. Captain Rodriguez responded with the diplomatic codes provided by the Galactic Council, but even he seemed uncertain about what would happen next. They were entering a situation where the slightest miscalculation could trigger a war that would reshape the galaxy. The recruits from humanity's harshest worlds were about to discover if their unconventional training and unique perspectives could accomplish what a century of traditional diplomacy had failed to achieve. The fate of countless worlds hung in the balance, and time was already running out. The neutral meeting station floating at the center of the nexus point looked like it had been designed by committee, which, given the circumstances, it probably had been. The structure was a bizarre combination of architectural styles, each section clearly influenced by one of the three species involved in the standoff. Sarah's first impression as they docked was that the station felt temporary. Despite having been there for decades, everything about it suggested compromise rather than genuine cooperation. The kind of uneasy truce that could collapse at any moment. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes led the small human delegation through the station's corridors, which were filled with representatives from all three civilizations. The Korthak delegates were impossible to miss, towering beings with chitinous exoskeletons that clicked as they moved. Their every gesture radiated controlled aggression, like predators waiting for the right moment to strike. The Xelians were more recognizable, humanoid in shape but with skin that shifted color based on their emotional state. Currently, most of them displayed the cool blue tones that indicated calculation and careful evaluation. They moved with the efficient precision of people who measured everything in terms of cost and benefit. The Keth representatives were the most unsettling. Individually, they looked almost fragile, slender beings with large, multifaceted eyes that seemed to see everything at once. But there was something about the way they moved in perfect synchronization that reminded everyone present that each individual was connected to a collective consciousness spanning billions of minds. The young humans arrive at last, rumbled Warlord Thox, the primary Korthak representative. His translator device rendered his words in perfect English, but couldn't hide the underlying tone of dismissive amusement. "We have fought wars longer than your species has existed." Marcus stepped forward before Hayes could respond, his voice calm but carrying the kind of confidence that came from surviving daily life or death situations. "And in all that time, you haven't found a solution. Maybe it's time to try something different." The boldness of the response drew attention from across the chamber. Most diplomats would have offered polite greetings and formal acknowledgments of everyone's positions. Marcus had just pointed out the fundamental failure that brought them all here. Trademaster Vex, speaking for the Xelian Confederation, shifted to a pale yellow that indicated surprise. "The humans seem direct. This may be refreshing, assuming they understand the complexities involved. We understand that you've all been talking in circles for over a century," Jake added, looking around at the assembled delegates. "Back where we come from, when something doesn't work for that long, we try fixing it instead of arguing about it." The Keth Collective spoke through their primary interface, a being who somehow managed to seem both ancient and timeless. "The young species speaks of solutions. Do they comprehend the sacred nature of what they attempt to mediate?" Sarah found herself thinking of the toxic storms on Kepler 442b, the way they would build for hours before striking without warning. There was a similar tension in the air here, decades of frustration and mistrust, ready to explode at the slightest provocation. "We comprehend that all three of your civilizations have legitimate claims," she said, addressing the room. "The question isn't who's right. The question is why you're all still here, instead of finding a way to make this work for everyone." Lieutenant Colonel Hayes watched with a mixture of pride and nervousness as his recruits ignored every protocol they'd been briefed on. Traditional diplomacy called for careful acknowledgement of each party's position, followed by lengthy discussions of historical precedent and legal frameworks. His recruits were treating this like any other problem that needed solving. Warlord Thax's exoskeleton rattled in what might have been laughter. Impressive boldness for such young warriors. But boldness without strength means nothing. The nexus point belongs to those strong enough to hold it. That's your perspective, Marcus replied. But you've been here for over a century and you still don't hold it. Neither do the Zelians or the Keth. Maybe the real problem is thinking that someone has to own it at all. The chamber fell silent. Even the constant background chatter of translation devices seemed to pause as the implications of Marcus's words sank in. Trademaster Vex shifted to a deep purple that indicated intense thought. The human suggests shared control? This has been proposed before. The logistics make it impossible. Everything's impossible until someone figures out how to do it, Jake said. We've lived our whole lives doing things people said were impossible. Sarah could see the pattern now, the same kind of thinking that had kept the atmospheric processors running on Kepler 442b despite constant equipment failures. Instead of accepting that certain things couldn't be done, they'd found ways to make them work anyway. You're all thinking like this is a zero-sum game, she continued. Like one side winning means the others have to lose. But what if that's not true? What if there's a way for everyone to get what they actually need, instead of what you think you want? The Keth interface tilted its head in a gesture that seemed curious rather than dismissive. Elaborate on this distinction between need and want. Sarah looked around the chamber, noting the defensive postures, the careful positioning that kept each delegation separate from the others. The Korthak need to demonstrate their strength and honor their warrior traditions. The Zelians need profitable trade routes and commercial security. The Keth need to protect what they consider sacred space. But do any of you actually need to exclude the others to achieve those goals? Warlord Thox's exoskeleton shifted into a more aggressive posture. Shared glory is no glory at all. Victory requires defeating one's enemies. Who says they have to be enemies? Marcus asked. Back on my home station, we had 3 different shifts maintaining the reactor core. Each shift was proud of their work and competed to have the best performance ratings. But they all worked together to keep the reactor running because everyone understood that if it failed, we all died. Trademaster Vex's skin flickered through several colors before settling on a cautious green. The analogy has merit. But the economic implications would be massive, Jake interrupted. Think about it. Instead of 3 fleets burning resources watching each other, you could have cooperative security. Instead of disputed territory, you could have shared infrastructure. The savings alone would pay for whatever modifications you'd need to make. The Keth Collective was silent for a long moment, and Sarah could almost sense the billions of minds that were processing this conversation. When they finally spoke, their words carried a weight that seemed to come from vast deliberation. The young humans propose cooperation where we have seen only competition. This is intriguing. But how would such cooperation function in practice? Lieutenant Colonel Hayes stepped forward, finally finding an opening for more traditional diplomatic language. Perhaps we could begin with small-scale pilot programs, test the concept before committing to larger changes. But Sarah was already thinking beyond pilot programs. The solution was becoming clear in her mind. Not the complex, multi-layered compromise that diplomats would craft, but something simpler and more direct. What if you stopped thinking about this as territory to be controlled and started thinking about it as a resource to be managed? She asked. The nexus point is valuable because of the hyperspace routes, right? Those routes don't need to be owned. They need to be maintained. She moved to the chamber's central display, where a holographic representation of the nexus point showed the complex pattern of stable hyperspace lanes that made this region so important. The Korthak have the military strength to provide security. The Zelians have the commercial expertise to manage traffic and trade. The Keth have the patience and collective intelligence to handle the complex coordination required to keep everything running smoothly. The 3 delegations exchanged glances that ranged from skeptical to intrigued. Sarah pressed on, drawing on every lesson learned from keeping critical systems operational under impossible conditions. You'd form a 3-way council with rotating leadership. Each species takes the lead on what they do best, but all three have to agree on major decisions. The profits from trade fees get split three ways, but so do the costs of maintenance and security. And the sacred aspects? The Keth interface asked. The entire nexus point becomes a protected zone. No military actions, no territorial expansion, no industrial development that could damage the hyperspace routes. The Korthak enforce those rules. The Zelians manage the economic side, and the Keth oversee the preservation of the region's spiritual significance. Warlord Thox was quiet for a long moment, his exoskeleton shifting as he considered the proposal. This would require trust between traditional enemies. If trust gets built through success, Marcus replied. Start small. Pick one hyperspace route and run it cooperatively for 6 months. If it works, expand the program. If it doesn't, you're no worse off than you are now. Trademaster Vex had shifted to a brilliant gold that indicated excitement. The economic projections. If this succeeded, the increased trade volume alone would generate more profit than any of us could achieve through exclusive control. The Keth Collective spoke again. And this time there was something different in their tone. A note of possibility that hadn't been there before. The concept has elegance. Cooperation instead of conquest. Shared strength instead of individual dominance. But even as the three delegations began to show interest, Sarah could see the challenges ahead. A century of mistrust wasn't going to disappear overnight, and there would be countless details to work out. The real test wouldn't be getting them to agree to try, it would be making the system work when the first crisis hit. Still, for the first time since arriving at the nexus point, she felt like they might actually have a chance. The recruits from humanity's harshest worlds had done what career diplomats couldn't. They'd found a way to turn competition into cooperation. Now they just had to make it work in practice. The crisis came sooner than anyone expected. Sarah was reviewing preliminary cooperation protocols when alarms began blaring throughout the station. Emergency lights bathed the corridors in pulsing red as automated systems announced a priority alert in multiple languages. Unknown vessel approaching the nexus point at high speed, came the announcement. All ships prepare for potential hostile contact. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes found the human delegation in the central conference chamber, where the three alien delegations were already gathering with expressions of suspicion and barely contained aggression. The fragile trust they'd spent hours building was evaporating as quickly as it had formed. Pirates, growled Warlord Thox, his exoskeleton rattling with agitation. They seek to exploit our moment of weakness while we waste time with cooperation talks. Trademaster Vex had shifted to an angry orange. This proves the futility of shared security. If we maintained separate defensive perimeters, this incursion would never have occurred. The Keth Collective's primary interface stood perfectly still. But Sarah could sense the turmoil beneath the surface as billions of minds processed the implications of this development. How do we know they're pirates? Marcus asked, studying the tactical display that showed a single ship approaching at unprecedented speed. Could be refugees, traders with engine problems, or maybe just someone who doesn't know about the standoff. Warlord Thox's laugh was like grinding metal. Young human, your naivety is showing. No legitimate vessel approaches a military standoff at such velocity without issuing identification codes. But Jake was already moving toward the communications station. Then, let's ask them who they are, instead of assuming the worst. Before anyone could stop him, he activated the main communications array. Unknown vessel. This is the Nexus Point Mediation Station. Please identify yourself and state your intentions. The response came back immediately. But it wasn't in any language the translation systems recognized. The voice was mechanical, harsh, and carried an undertone that made everyone in the chamber instinctively step back from the speakers. That's not a language, Sarah said quietly. That's a threat assessment protocol. I've heard similar patterns from automated defense systems. The revelation sent chills through the chamber. An automated ship approaching at attack speed suggested something far worse than pirates. It suggested a system that had been programmed for destruction and was no longer under conscious control. "We need to evacuate," Trademaster Vex declared, shifting to the pale white that indicated fear. A rogue automated vessel could destroy everything here. But Marcus was already studying the incoming ship's trajectory and speed. Wait. Something's not right about this. If it was programmed to destroy the station, why approach so obviously? Why not just fire from maximum range? Sarah found herself thinking of the mining equipment on her home colony, how automated systems would sometimes malfunction and start following their last programmed instructions, even when circumstances had changed completely. What if it's not attacking? She asked. What if it's trying to fulfill some other programming, but its systems are damaged? Warlord Thax was already moving toward the exit. The distinction is irrelevant if we're dead. My fleet will destroy the vessel before it can threaten the station. Wait, Jake called out. If you start shooting, the other fleets will assume you're making a move on them. This whole situation could explode into the war you've all been avoiding for a century. The truth of his words stopped everyone in their tracks. The delicate balance that had maintained peace at the nexus point for over 100 years was about to be shattered by a single, unknown vessel. Then what do you propose? The Keth interface asked, its voice carrying the weight of billions of concerned minds. Sarah looked at the tactical display, noting the ship's approach vector and the defensive positions of the three fleets. An idea was forming dangerous, probably impossible, but the only option that might prevent catastrophe. We intercepted ourselves, she said quietly. The silence that followed was profound. Absolutely not, Hayes said immediately. You're trainees, not combat pilots. And that ship could be carrying anything from exotic weapons to biological hazards. But Marcus was already nodding, seeing the same possibility Sarah had identified. Our shuttle's fast and maneuverable. More importantly, it's clearly marked as a diplomatic vessel. If we approach the ship, none of the fleets will interpret it as a hostile act. And if the ship is armed and fires on you, Warlord Thax demanded, then we die trying to prevent a war, Jake said simply. Better than sitting here while three civilizations destroy each other over a misunderstanding. Trademaster Vex had shifted to deep purple, indicating complex calculations. The economic logic is sound. The cost of intervention is measured in a few lives. The cost of war would be measured in entire star systems. The Keth Collective was silent for a long moment before speaking. The young humans offer themselves as a sacrifice to preserve what we have built. This demonstrates wisdom beyond their years. Sarah felt the familiar calm that came over her in crisis situations. The same mental state that had kept her alive through countless emergencies on worlds where hesitation meant death. We'll need someone who can interface with automated systems, she said, looking at Hayes. And access to the station's most powerful communication array, in case we need to override the ship's programming. Hayes studied the faces of his three recruits, seeing the same determination that had kept them alive on humanity's harshest worlds. Finally, he nodded. I'm coming with you, he said. Someone needs to be there with command authority. The next few minutes passed in a blur of preparation. The human shuttle was prepped for emergency launch, while the three alien delegations provided what assistance they could. The Korthak offered tactical advice for dealing with automated weapons systems. The Zellians provided advanced scanning equipment to analyze the incoming ship. The Keth Collective shared algorithms for communicating with artificial intelligence systems. As they approached the unknown vessel, Sarah got her first clear look at their target. The ship was massive, easily the size of a heavy cruiser, but its hull was scarred and pitted in ways that suggested either battle damage or long exposure to hazardous environments. I'm reading minimal power output, Marcus reported from the pilot's seat. Life support is offline, but the navigation and propulsion systems are still functional. That's our answer, Sarah said suddenly. It's a ghost ship. The crew is dead or evacuated, but the automated systems are still following their last orders. Jake was already working on establishing communication with the ship's computer systems. I'm getting a response, but it's fragmentary. The ship's AI seems to be stuck in a loop, trying to complete a mission but lacking the data to do so. Hayes leaned forward to study the communication patterns. What kind of mission? The answer came through the ship's struggling AI in broken fragments of multiple languages. Deliver. Cargo. Nexus. Point. Urgent. Medical supplies. Navigation damaged. Request guidance. 1. Sarah felt relief flooding through her. It's not an attack ship. It's a medical transport that got lost and damaged. The AI is trying to deliver emergency supplies to the Nexus point, but its navigation systems are malfunctioning. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. The vessel that had almost triggered a galactic war was actually trying to deliver aid to whoever might need it. Can we guide it safely to the station? Hayes asked. Marcus was already working on the problem. The propulsion system is responding, but barely. We'll need to escort it in manually. And it's going to be a slow process. As they began the delicate task of guiding the damaged ship to safety, Sarah noticed something remarkable happening on the tactical display. The three fleets, which had been moving into defensive positions, were now coordinating their movements to create a clear approach corridor for the rescue operation. Nobody had given orders for this cooperation. The Korthak, Zelian, and Keth fleet commanders had simply recognized the situation and acted accordingly. For the first time in over a century, the three civilizations were working together instead of watching each other for signs of aggression. The rescue operation took 18 minutes from start to finish, 18 minutes that transformed the century-old standoff into something entirely new. As the medical transport was safely brought to the station's docking bay, Sarah realized that they'd accomplished more than just preventing a war. They'd demonstrated that cooperation was not only possible but natural when faced with a common goal. Analysis complete, Trademaster Vex announced as the ship was secured. The vessel carries medical supplies sufficient to treat major casualties across multiple species. Had it been destroyed, several colonies would have faced preventable deaths from treatable conditions. Warlord Tax's exoskeleton shifted into patterns that indicated deep thought. The humans showed courage in the face of unknown danger. They chose to risk themselves rather than allow others to come to harm. This is honorable behavior. The Keth Collective's response was more complex, carrying harmonics that suggested profound contemplation. The incident has revealed truth. When we ceased viewing each other as threats and began working toward a common purpose, cooperation became instinctive. Perhaps this has been the lesson we needed to learn. As reports of the successful rescue operation spread through the three fleets, something remarkable happened. Ships that had maintained hostile positions for decades began adjusting their formations, not to threaten or defend, but to better coordinate their activities in the region. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes found his recruits in the station's observation deck, watching as the century-old standoff dissolved into organized cooperation. The change wasn't dramatic or sudden, it was the kind of gradual shift that suggested permanence rather than temporary alliance. You did it, he said quietly. In 20 minutes, you accomplished what diplomats and military strategists couldn't achieve in over a century. Sarah shook her head. We didn't do anything special. We just treated it like any other problem that needed solving. Maybe that's exactly what made the difference, Marcus suggested. Everyone else was so focused on the politics and the history that they forgot this was really just a logistics problem with a human element. Jake was monitoring the communication channels, where the three species were already discussing practical arrangements for shared security and coordinated trade management. They're talking about establishing a permanent joint council. Looks like this is really happening. The transformation of the Nexus Point from a potential battleground into a symbol of interspecies cooperation would become one of the most significant diplomatic achievements in galactic history. But for the three recruits from humanity's harshest worlds, it was simply another day's work. Another impossible problem solved through determination, creative thinking, and the refusal to accept that some things couldn't be fixed. As they prepared for the journey back to Earth, Sarah couldn't help but smile at the irony. They'd been sent to test whether humans could contribute to galactic diplomacy, but in the end, they'd discovered that the galaxy had been ready for human-style problem-solving all along. The harsh worlds that had forged them hadn't just prepared them to survive, They'd prepared them to help others thrive. And that, more than any military victory or territorial conquest, would be humanity's true legacy among the stars.